I like heavy blankets, and I like weighted pillows on my lap. I'm very, well, I mean, who am I kidding? I'm on the spectrum, and so having a lot of proprioceptive input and sensory things that are super soft and cozy and weighted, and mugs that just fit, and Bibles that feel soft and suede-y, and those are things that are important to me. I like things that feel really good, in the textures and the sensory parts of it. So that's just me. But then I'm on the autism spectrum, and so are my kids, and so are my sisters. So you know what? Maybe we're just all weird, or maybe there's a lot more of us out there than we think there are. That is entirely possible. I've thought about talking more about abuse and women on the spectrum, but what I have found is that most abuse survivors who are on the spectrum actually have no idea that they're on the spectrum, and they just think they're weird and they don't fit anywhere, and they feel isolated, and they feel like they're different. They feel like they're some kind of unicorn or endangered species, and they have no idea that they're actually adult autistic women who've never been diagnosed, because in our generation, nobody diagnosed autistic girls. We all had only research on boys and autism, and there's an awful lot of autistic women out there who are brilliant and very high functioning, even though they really don't know that term. They don't like that term, but they mask very well. Amanda, I see you saying, I think you might be made aware of that through a good friend, did the quiz, and yes. What is the spectrum? Kathleen, okay, well, we're just gonna wait on Philippians here, because this is something I'm passionate about talking about. The autism spectrum is a spectrum of neurodiverse brain wiring. Now, I am not a medical professional, so I'm speaking to you as an autistic woman, and as someone who's just done a lot of research, lay research on it. But the autism spectrum is a different way of brain functioning. When we look at the autism spectrum, we tend to typically think of certain, I was just going to say gifted. Okay, so autism is a spectrum. There are individuals who are autistic and highly gifted. And because they are highly gifted, people don't assume that they are autistic because they don't fit the traditional negative stereotype of boys with autism. Women with autism, I'll just speak to that because I'm a woman, and I'm assuming pretty much all of y'all on here are females too. Women with autism present very differently than autistic men or boys, and primarily all of the research that has been done in the past has been on autistic boys, and very much on the stereotypical autistic boys, not the type that is like what they used to call Asperger's or Asperger's in the UK and Australia. Now in the US, they stopped calling it Asperger's, and they just started calling it high functioning autism, and just lumped it in with the spectrum of everything else. And that being said, where was I going with that? So they quit using the term Asperger's in the US and just started calling it autism spectrum. But in Australia and UK, they still term it, they pronounce it differently, Asperger's. Anyway, regardless of all that, there are multiple forms of autism or different ways that it presents. The fundamental thing, especially with those who tend to go undiagnosed because they look fairly normal on the outside, is that it is not a neurotypical brain wiring. The brain in an autistic spectrum person, I don't call it autism spectrum disorder, but the brain it just functions and is wired differently. It sees patterns differently. It sees data differently. It notices details differently. The autistic brain tends to approach relationships differently. Some traits of autistic female women are feeling like they never fit in with other girls their age, because other girls their age were interested in shallow, just everyday kind of subjects. So you have the girl who is incredibly, stop notifications. You have the girl who is incredibly, like, she's really interested in science or in words or writing or stamp collecting or, I don't know, Lisa Frank stickers or whatever. She's like super obsessed with certain types of interests and often quite gifted. Autistic girls tend to be hyperlingual, which means they talked early, they learned to read early, they were very sensitive. Yes, being a highly sensitive person, maybe bright lights gives them a headache. They tend to be the bookish kind, or they were just very focused on certain interests, and often tended not to fit in with the gaggle of girls that would run along and be all interested in boys and be worried about their looks and shopping and like stereotypical, like, oh my goodness, I broke a nail kind of valley girl kind of person, and the autistic girl is just like, I don't have time for this crazy. Like, I want to go talk about real things. I want to go contemplate the issues in the world. I want to figure out why things exist. My 10-year-old daughter tells me already that sometimes she will climb up into the top of the tree in our yard and just sit there and think about why the world exists. And it's just such an autism spectrum girl thing to do. And I remember being the same way as a kid. Yes, not clicky. And so as a result, an autistic girl may have grown up feeling completely like a fish out of water in the neurotypical social structure of most girls around her. And also, autistic girls and women tend to be hesitant to get into relationships, and then they, once they are in a relationship where they have a friendship, whether it is a romantic relationship or a social friendship, they tend to be intensely loyal, highly conscientious. It's like physically painful to think of betraying trust of someone. And they may do this even in their work things. Like, I gave my word when I was hired to work at this job, even though this job is killing me and I'm just dying inside. I'm not going to quit this job because I might let my workplace down. And can read between the lines. Yes, tends to be highly intuitive, tends to see patterns in things and to draw intuitive conclusions, and to understand what's behind what's going on, unless it relates to their own relationship, and then they're completely blind. Like, you can see the dynamics in someone else's relationship or someone else's issue or problems a mile away. But if it's yours, you're like, how did I miss that? Because of the loyalty. So once you give your loyalty, you're like completely blind, and you just are willing to just sacrifice, and it's very, very difficult to come to the point that you're done. But then when you're done. Like, not like I'm going and then maybe not, and then I'm going and then maybe not, but you're like done, never looking back when you finally reach that point. Also, with the being able to read between the lines, an autistic woman very often will have, my autistic friends and I call it a sense of knowing. We just call it the knowing. You see something and you're like, XYZ is going to happen. And your friends are like, that's not true. And then it happens. You're like, I told you. And you get really, really tired of people not believing when you recognize a pattern. And you may not even be able to explain why. You may not be able to say, oh, well, this is why that's going to happen. I've seen this and I've seen this, and XYZ adds up to this particular future thing being very likely to happen, or being able to tell that someone is up to no good, or being able to predict patterns. And people always because neurotypical people don't see the world the same way. It's not a bad thing, but neurotypical world people just simply don't see those same patterns. That's not the way their brain is wired, and it's a kind of an autistic superpower. So, but when you see those things and when you can predict those things, people think you're either being a smart-ass know-it-all, or that you're being cocky, or that you don't know what you're talking about, and then they act all shocked when it happens exactly like you said it would. So raise your hand if any of you watching, if any of this applies to any of you. In all of that, those are all very common signs. And of course, none of those actually mean, yes, you're guaranteed that you are a woman on the autism spectrum, but they are common traits that are included in this bucket. Also tends to, here's other things that just seem to be in that same bucket of things. Yes, it's a smaller percentage of people. It's a much bigger percentage of people that are actually diagnosed, but it is a small percentage of the regular world. If you look back in history, Marie Curie would have been autistic. Joan of Arc absolutely would have been autistic. Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, all of these people that saw the world in remarkably different ways, they were all on the autism spectrum. Thomas Jefferson, tens of thousands of books. His obsession, we call it a monomania, his obsession in one thing was books and learning. And so there are massive historical figures that we don't realize until you go and you really look at it. They were all autistic. The reason they saw things differently, the reason they were able to do the things that they were able to do, the reason that they were able to hyper focus and lose themselves in creative projects or in scientific projects or whatever, and that they were thought that they were a little weird or quirky with the neurotypicals around them. And they were just kind of like that nutty professor kind of idea. Even the females, they were all autistic. They were brilliant, freaking geniuses, but they were autistic. And that was why they were able to contribute those types of things to the world. So anyway, it's highly undiagnosed in women. There is an extraordinarily higher proportion of conscientious, loyal, creative, brilliant, slightly socially different women in the abuse survivor circles, because women who have this hyper focus, hyper loyalty, and often feel very alone tend to be more vulnerable to mind manipulation and to the charm and to the cognitive dissonance that happens in this type of domestic violence and abuse. And then you throw in theological things where women have been taught that you need to make yourself smaller, you need to fit under his umbrella, you need to shrink down your mind, and you may have had a brilliant, phenomenal mind, and you were told to really reduce yourself in order to fit theology and be under someone else. Then it just exacerbates the situations. So anyway, there are an awful lot of women on the spectrum in my groups. I can tell. I watch you interact. I listen to your questions. I know it's a deeply personal journey for everyone. I'm not saying everybody needs to go and decide they're on the spectrum. I'm not saying everybody needs to go get diagnosed. I'm just saying if any of this fits you, have it on your radar. Do some reading. If you want more information, would you like me to do more videos on this? I can. Because now I'm probably going to stop this video, relabel it, and then do another video for Philippians. How's that? Because the people who wanted Philippians Jesus Bubble didn't get it yet. And this one is titled Philippians Jesus Bubble. So I will stop this video. But before I do, anyone else have any questions? Yes? No, I'm not seeing any questions coming up. That's okay. I will watch the chat afterwards. But yeah, so I have chosen to be pretty open about being on the spectrum. A lot of women don't. That's something I didn't talk about. Yes, there are assessments on this. It's extremely expensive to find a formal expert in female autism. Okay, so where can I learn more? Goodness, why don't I do a blog post on it, on my articles on Wilderness to Wild, and just say for women who think they are on the spectrum, these are things that can be helpful. How do we find out if this fits us? I will do that, and I will link it here. Do you think this plays a part of the abuse cycle? Actually, I don't call it an abuse cycle. I call it an abuse vortex because there's no linear cycle where one thing leads to another. They're usually all the tools are being used at once. But yes, absolutely. I think it plays a part in autistic women being deceived socially and being more vulnerable to deceit. And then I think it plays a role in autistic women struggling to find the courage to leave because they have intense loyalty. Not that they don't see patterns. Autistic women tend to see patterns and to recognize recognize the data and to put the pieces together far better. We tend to see patterns far better than the average person, but yes, like Kathleen just said, but it's harder to see tactics because we tend to believe other people are trustworthy because autistic women have a very, very hard time lying. And truth and justice are passionately important, much more than to the neurotypical individual. I saw a couple of things up above. Do I think this, okay, how do we find out if this fits us? I'm going to do a blog post and link there's some free online assessments and they're really, really insightful. And there are some great articles about how your brain works and how you are able to like dig down into projects and hyperfocus. And then if that hyperfocus is broken, it feels like it's impossible to get it back. Just because of how your mind functions. So I will do that. How did I discover I was on the spectrum? I did not discover that I was on the spectrum until my mid-30s. And I had always known I was different. By the time I was 5, I knew that I was different. I didn't know why. I could just feel it. I would watch other girls with imaginative play with their dolls. And I didn't understand why they would do the things they would do. I'll do a video on that another time. Some of the things that early opened my eyes, but just socially, I was just like, why is that play? Like, why is that fun? I don't get it. That was when I was about 5. When I was 8, I remember recognizing I don't fit with these other girls. I don't know what it is, but I'm not one of them. I'm just different. I don't even want to be here. And then, of course, there was that internal longing to be involved and included, and to be like everyone else, but also knowing I just wasn't. And then in high school, around 11th grade, I really, really just became glaringly obvious. My parents came back from the mission field, and now I was homeschooled. So at home, I was allowed to be just exactly myself. My parents never pushed me to be anybody but who I was. They just pushed me to be they didn't even push, but they strongly encouraged me to be a better version of myself, just to always be improving. And I was free to nerd out at home and not be judged for it. But in high school, in 11th grade, I went to school and I realized that I had to make myself smaller in order for social safety. I had to not be me. In college, college was its own experience. I'll do a video on that some other time. And then as a mom in my mid-30s, as a single mom, I met someone who worked in neurodevelopment, behavioral and neurological development in pediatrics. And they were a pediatrics expert, and they were watching my kids, and they were like, you realize your kids are like super ADHD and they're on the spectrum, right? And I'm like, no, what are you talking about? And they're like, well, have you considered getting them assessed? I'm like, assessed for what? And at this point, I had discovered that I was, as far as the Myers-Briggs, that I was INTJ personality type, which fits along with this. A lot of autistic women are INTJ, INFJ, INFP. Some are ENTJ, the more outgoing ones. But there's definitely that strong intuitive thinker, feeler, cause warrior, justice-oriented, truth-oriented kind of thing. And so I had realized, because less than 1% of the women in the world are INTJ. So I was like, oh, that's why I feel like an endangered species and a fish out of water all my life. But it wasn't just that. And so as my children went through the developmental and behavioral and neurological processes, I began realizing, wait, all the things that are clicking and giving them a diagnosis, those are all the ways they're like me. That's all the things that I did as a child that they're just like me. And this is all what's getting them a diagnosis. So I was like, guess what? I'm exactly the same. I mean, I'm my own person. I'm different, but it's all these same things. So I'm looking down here. That's how I ended up realizing that it fit me too. Not good in groups. Yes, very often autistic women are very, very much struggle in groups. Some learn to mask very well. And masking is where you copy neurotypical people in order to fit in. And if you have a job or a social interaction that requires you to copy neurotypical people and to mask, that's what it's called, in order to fit in, then when you come home, you're going to feel absolutely slaughtered, completely exhausted, shattered by the end of the day or the end of the event, because it takes so much energy to fit in and to mask, because you're watching the people around you and you're subconsciously acting like them socially in order to not stand out. And so it takes the observation, and it requires the mimicking, and anyway, we call it masking in the autistic circles. And it's exhausting. So when you find somebody that you don't have to mask with, that you can just be your completely authentic self with, it is inspiring and rejuvenating, and you click and you feel really, really at home with that person. And it's like a soul click. I have two sisters like this, and we just, it's like not three, well, two sisters and like a best friend, and we all just, we understand each other. It's a completely different wavelength, but that doesn't happen all the time. Okay. I am going to, you can end up losing yourself to belong. Yeah, and most of us do. I'm best one-on-one with and being myself. Yep. Most of us go through at least a season of losing ourselves, and then when we come out of abuse, when we come out of it, if we realize these things about ourselves, it can become just a crazy, intense, passionate determination. You are not going to lose yourself again. You're going to cling to the things that make you you. You're going to chase the truth. You're going to not in any way betray the identity God gave you for fitting in with people anymore. And that's a very healthy and healing and freeing thing. Okay. Totally didn't intend to go there this morning. I'm going to pause this and I'm going to start again. So if you're here with me for Philippians, to finish up our Philippians, I'm going to stop this video. People pleasing is involved. Yes, absolutely. Up until they interfere with your core inner values. And then it's like, oh, heck no. I am not violating my core inner values. Things you're describing are traits of an Enneagram 9, which I am, peacemaker, can be very much so. I'm an Enneagram 1, which is the driving perfectionist, which is also Enneagram 9, 1, 5. Those are really the most common ones on that cross over with autism that I have found. That's just my side observations. I have no empirical evidence for that. That's just my observations. Okay, I'm going to stop this video. I will relabel it as the one where I went on an autism spectrum rabbit trail, and I'm going to come right back. If you're here for Philippians 4, and we're going to finish that this morning, don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Okay? See ya.